Welcome back and thank you very much for staying with us. This week has been a busy one, especially in Cape Town, where the investing in African Mining Indaba took place. The number of coronavirus cases has doubled over the past week, and there are clear signs it may have damaged China's economic growth prospects in 2020. On the other hand, gold has climbed up to the $1,500 mark. Well, for a market rep, we are joined by Ricus Reeders, who is wealth manager at PSG. Thank you very much for coming, sir.
Welcome.
Yeah, well, I mean, are we ever going to see a change in the way things have been happening in the mining industry, especially having an annual mining indaba, but the mining figures always come on the downside. So what's going to change?
Well, I think before we get too pessimistic, I was thinking about the same type of indaba 3-4 years ago, and the mood then, which was very pessimistic. Whereas now, at least there were some smiles on people's faces, because obviously we've had a nice little run in commodities. So there's a general sense of positiveness, but the problem still remains red tape. You know, if we compare ourselves locally with somebody like Canada, which has got about over 1,000 junior miners listed, we've got 10 in this country. And the only reason we've got 10 is part legacy, but also because there's still too much red tape in getting a license and actually developing new resources. So what we're left with is fairly old resources that are difficult and expensive to mine.
So mining licenses, and then companies being lured to come in and they can generate their own electricity without a license?
Well, that was certainly part of the big news. In other words, whether the mining company can generate their own electricity, or whether indeed we're going to have a second, some kind of ESCOM, shall we call it, to provide power, according to the minister. I think both of those at the moment are just talk. If mining companies can produce their own power, from what source, how will it get regulated? Will they in fact be allowed to do it without going through a lot of red tape again? That's for the future.
All right, so the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry had a business confidence index which declined 0.9%. I mean, this downward trajectory of how BCI has been like, is it an indication that we are likely not to see a surge in companies having confidence to do business in the country?
Yes, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. The less optimistic you are, the less likely you are to invest money, but as a result, you're not really getting the results, so that makes you more pessimistic. So what needs to change is the mood of the country, and that comes, I think, from policy. In other words, if we've got a policy that's market friendly, people will say, well, it might be going, I might not feel as confident right now, because that's what it measures. But looking ahead, 6 months, 12 months, I feel less pessimistic, therefore I'm more likely to risk some money into building something, into investing into something.
All right. So when we look at the local markets, the JSE hasn't had so much dramatic activity. But looking at gold, it has been on the rise, reaching the $1,500 mark.
Yeah.
Well, surely it has solidified its position as a safe haven.
Well, it's always been that, possibly to a lesser extent, as just the world of money has evolved, where people will also go and or find safety in the dollar or in the yen or in the Swiss franc. But certainly with the coronavirus outbreak in China hitting the news, gold has had a nice little rally, and it's trying to break through an all-time high at about the $1,590 level. Whether it's going to do that really depends on whether this global crisis in the virus itself is worse than anticipated, in which case it should fulfill that role as a safe haven, as a less riskier asset, and one might very well see new highs. But it's a 50-50 at the moment, because we don't know how far this crisis is going to go on for.
Yeah, and interesting enough, the New York Stock Exchange and the Dow has been up 0.3%.
Yeah, it's been quite crazy. I think when the news sort of broke, we had a a flight to safety, stocks sold down. And over the past 2-3 days, except for today, I see we're sort of heading down again. We had a huge recovery, and what happens during times of uncertainty is that markets react excessively, either to the downside or to the upside. I think the past 2-3 days of really good gains was probably too much, and we need to just pull back and say there is a risk. We're not quite sure how to quantify it yet, but there's no reason to flee in panic or to get overly optimistic.
Talking about the coronavirus that you have already alluded to, I mean, like, it's going to affect the movement of people and goods, and so far there's going to be a pullback in as far as the Chinese, or rather the Asian markets are concerned. Really, shouldn't it be time to get the vaccine already?
I wish we could. I mean, there is some developments where they've they meaning a couple of institutions have done some experiments in petri dishes, which is by no means close to it actually being effective as far as humans are concerned. So a anti-vaccine or a vaccine for that is still months, if not years off. The question now is how can it be contained, how well can it be contained, and how soon can we start seeing a drop in the infection rate. That's anybody's guess. And as I said, without there being a cure, at the moment it's treating it and containing it. That's the important bit.
Right. So now going to the U.S., Donald Trump must be a happy man this week.
Well, yes, not unexpectedly. His impeachment didn't go through, and so that what would have surprised the market is if it did go through. So that didn't really affect the market. But certainly taking a look at his popularity polls, he looks set to actually have a big chance of being re-elected again coming the elections in November.
Okay, I was actually going to ask you, does it look like he's going nowhere? But looking at the way that things are, it looks like the Democrats will be very frustrated, and they're going to get a subdued response from the voters.
I think that's one of the problems. I'm no expert in American politics, but taking a look at the headline and taking a look at the analysis, I don't think it's Donald Trump obviously has a huge support base, but certainly the Democrats haven't done themselves any favor by really having a very disjointed and very weak opposite choice to Trump in the form of candidates for the upcoming election. Very much the same as they had with the previous election, where there's no real good alternative.
Right. So next week, President Cyril Ramaphosa will be addressing the nation. I mean, like yesterday, he was with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Is the president really going to have something optimistic and enthusiastic about the country now? I mean, like, when you look at the South African economy, are there any hopes for green shoots somewhere?
One would hope so, but one way to take a look at that sort of optimism is to take a look at the price of the country, or otherwise known as the exchange rate. And we've seen the rand pushing above 15 rand to the dollar, and it's been a weakening since yesterday. And I think there's two factors there: the business confidence we were talking about, and I won't say pessimism, but uncertainty about what he will say come next week, because I think the expectation is that there might not be enough substance in what what he's going to say, but the need is for that to be there. And I think the fear that of disappointment of what the eventual speech is going to say is weighing in on the currency, on the whole confidence issue, and that's why we are seeing the rand weaken.
So isn't it maybe there isn't anything positive to report on any SOE at the moment?
I don't know. In other words, at least I think a lot of problems have been identified, maybe too late, but it's not being glossed over. We know SA is in trouble, we know Eskom is in trouble, we know PRASA is in trouble, and there are things being done. Hopefully it is enough, and hopefully the message that comes through in the State of the Nation address is forceful and detailed enough to give impetus to this whole recovery process that's happening with the state-owned enterprises.
Right. Thank you very much for making time for your analysis in this week's Wrap. And of course, we'll see you in not so distant future.
Thank you, Gordon.